the idea of enactivism as a philosophy of nature, which I suggested, really is not something that sort of is a separate idea. It's very closely tied to the question of how you think of doing science in a kind of naturalistic fashion, of course, and what naturalism means, what nature means within that framework. So this is a question actually that goes back again to Merleau-Ponty in his very first book, The Structure of Behavior. He talked about the notion of nature and the idea that we maybe have to rethink the whole concept of nature. You know, what exactly do we mean by nature? And of course, if we just take a kind of scientific naturalism and you say, well, we think of nature as this kind of objective thing out there that we are trying to study and manipulating so that it sort of gives up its secrets and so forth. That kind of objectivist conception of nature is the type of thing that Merleau-Ponty was trying to rethink. And if we start to think along the enactivist way of enacting our environments and basically our nature of being embodied as itself being part of nature, then again with Merleau-Ponty, this is a different way of thinking about nature from the kind of scientific naturalism of objectifying nature. That, to me, that sort of suggests that we could think of enactivism as a rethinking of how we do science, as a rethinking of the mind, also as a rethinking of what we mean by nature, to what extent nature is, or what extent the mind is part of nature, and what that would mean.
Yeah, brilliant. I thoroughly enjoyed reading that part of the book, and if I may kind of go on a bit of a speculative point here, this is also why I kind of get annoyed when I kind of hear, like, I feel like sometimes people frame the question the wrong way, where yes, if you view nature or the material world as like this mechanical world in this Cartesian sense, and all coming from someone like Francis Bacon, sure, then probably it does problematize this kind of inactivist way of thinking, and then that's when people suddenly leap into things like idealism, and they're like, okay, the nature, it's all mind, everything is mind, or something like that. And for me, that's like kind of like, if I may put it a bit crudely, loose kind of thinking, where it's like you haven't even clearly defined the axioms or the framework as to how you're asking these questions. And what I appreciate about enactivism is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, so Ezekiel de Palo, the person who wrote the book The Linguistic Bodies, and a fantastic thinker, I really enjoy reading his stuff, and he kind of mentions like, well, enactivism is still very much a materialist theory. It's something that's, you can speak of enactivism and you can use an activist approach while being a materialist without having any kind of penchant towards like mysticism or any of this like new age kind of stuff. It can still speak of the fact that, yeah, we live in a material world, and the world we live in. But of course, it does kind of take perhaps reformulating what we mean by the material world. So on that note, I'm curious if I could ask you this kind of speculative question: where do you stand in this like it's a very popular debate online, really, materialism versus idealism, and all these really speculative questions, like metaphysical questions, really. As an activist thinker, where do you find, like, do you think this debate it's like a useless debate, or where do you sit on this whole debate of, materialism versus an activist, idealism, and then I guess panpsychism and all the other different isms that come up in this conversation?
Yeah. I can definitely say I'm not a panpsychist, so it's one thing I can be clear about. And I'm not sure I could sort of outline a set of reasons why I would go that way. But anyway, this really does tie in to to just those questions about nature that we were talking. And what we can ask, what do we mean by the material world? Certainly, it, it's a physical world that we have to deal with. We are physical creatures. We have bodies. And bodies are sort of playing an important role in our ability to think about the world and to engage in action in that world. So we are, in a certain sense, part of that material world, and that's a good starting point. But at the same time, we seem to, well, I'm going to use a term that is a little tricky, but actually, Merleau-Ponty said this about language. He said that language in some way transcends the body. And it's not that he meant that it leaves the body behind, but it might be better to think of it as saying that language carries the body, further into kind of cultural set of practices and communications with others. So if we start thinking about our interactions with other people, not just in terms of language, but in terms of action and the formation of habits and the formation of social institutions, and there's a lot there to talk about. But if we think in those terms, then, well, are we saying that those are features that transcend the material world? And I don't actually want to say that, because it sounds like it's there's something spooky about it. But in some way, those are in those phenomena that are tied to sociality and to the generation of meaning and so forth. Those are things that, in a certain way, are irreducible just to purely material processes. This is, of course, a challenge to try to explain how all of this works, but this is part of what the enactivists are trying to do when, for example, they talk about social cognition. And Ezekiel Apollo, as you say, is talking about language here. So I think, we are trying to say things that means we are not naive materialists. But at the same time, materialism is where we start, and it's I guess how we would test our ideas as well, if that makes
Absolutely,
sense.
yeah. That
Yeah.
last bit, how you verify your ideas and test your ideas, is really important for me because, I mean, I guess I take somewhat of a Wittgensteinian approach to language, where I find, especially, it's for lack of a better term, sexy to talk about panpsychism. It's it gets people turning that consciousness and all these huge questions, but I find that there's something even rather narcissistic about that way of thinking, where you think that the whole universe is something like the mind. So you kind of enter, it's a very anthropocentric way of thinking. And what I appreciate about the enactivist thinkers and even the kind of the big thinkers in the field is they, first of all, they're very scientifically oriented, and they try to verify their theories through science and other means too, like social science and whatnot. But also, they still, and again, I mean, Ezekiel de Paulo makes this point that the difference still lies that there is something called the material world. Not everything is the mind. Not everything is an extension of your whatever consciousness experience or whatever. There's still a difference, but that difference is perhaps viewed, for lack of a better term, dialectically, if I may say. But yeah, that was great. Thank you for that, Professor Gallagher.